Freeze!
Welcome back to Propology 101, and today we're going to be finishing up our discussion on the E-11, and we will be talking about the Return of the Jedi E-11. Now, Return of the Jedi is kind of a weird movie. Out of all the original trilogy, a large majority of it was shot here in the U.S., and that would be all the Tatooine scenes and Endor, were all, basically everything was in California, to be honest. With changes in production and a lot of things that were going on, we see, like we saw with the D-817 for Return of the Jedi, it was based on a Modelgun Corporation and not on a Sterling build. Well, the same is with the Return of the Jedi E-11. It was also based on the Modelgun Corporation Sterling, but technically it wasn't the Sterling it was replicating. It was replicating the C1, which was the licensed Sterling version that the Canadian government had made. We've already talked about that, but basically they made an all sheet metal version to save money of the Sterling, and it looked a little bit different. And that is what Modelgun Corporation replicated instead of the actual Sterling, which is what this is. For the most part, what you'll see in Return of the Jedi are castings, very similar to the Empire Strikes Back stunt version. You'll see a lot of castings. And matter of fact, I think this might be also the only original trilogy movie that none of our heroes have a Sterling or an E-11. So anyway, since they were all castings, or most of them were castings, they were clay filled, backfilled with clay, or especially around the trigger and trigger guard to add strength and ease of casting. You'll also see that the entire interior structure of the blaster has been filled in. It looks like they may have actually filled it in, slid pipes in to seal off the inside. It also sports a cut-down magazine, just like the earlier Sterling E-11s had. And then from there on, it's pretty much kind of a little bit different. For example, it doesn't use an M38 or an M19 scope. Now, what they did make is a custom scope that I think is designed to replicate the M19 scope. And this particular customized scope is also used on the DL-44s from Return of the Jedi. So basically, it's a cut-down scope with just the rear reticle, and it goes down to the 1-inch tube. And they capped it with what looks like just like a cup or some sort of cap or something, and they riveted that to the end of the scope where it had been cut off. And then they put a 1-inch Weaver scope ring on it. And from what I can tell, most of the Weaver scope rings, if not all, the Weaver scope rings we see are actual real scope rings, and it's holding on the actual scope to the scope mount. Also, there's a little greebly in the front. It's actually two separate parts. One part is completely unknown, and the base of that front greebly that's on the front of the scope is actually the dust cap from one of those 4x20 scopes that we would see on Boba Fett's EE3. It's that round dust cover that's a little bit cone-shaped. That is what they use for the front of their scopes. And then there's another greebly that sits on it, but that we don't really know what it is. Now, the scope mount is also completely custom made, and the scope mount appears to be cast on the blaster. So when the blaster was cast, the scope mount was there already. And what we find is in the front, there's a greebly at the front. And what that actually is, it's kind of interesting. If we go back to our DL-18 skiff guard blaster discussion, we talked about how they removed the rear sight and used the scope rail that came with that air pistol, which is a RO72 Panther. Well, they removed the rear sight and the rear sight base and put the scope mount on and mounted their scope to that. And what you find on the front of the Return of the Jedi E-11 scope mount is that rear sight base. Now, they've removed the sight from it, but the base is there on that scope mount in front of the scope. Moving down to greeblies, there's not a whole lot going on as far as greeblies. It's not nearly as many greeblies as we would find on the ESB stunt version, but what we do have is on the left-hand side, we have a piece that we've already talked about before in the DL-21 discussion, and that is apart from the Nakata, Browning High Power. Nakata was another company like Modelgun Corporation that made nice high-end replica firearms. And the part that they used from the Browning High Power replica is part number 34. I think it's called the hammer block or something. I can't remember exactly what it's called. But that piece is mounted right on the left-hand side, just behind the magazine. And moving on back further near the back, in the same area where we would have found those rebar clips on the Empire Strikes Back E-11, we find two hammers. The hammers you pull back and pull the trigger and the hammer falls and fires the round. We find two hammers from a Modelgun Corporation replica of a Smith & Wesson Combat Auto. There's two of those hammers on the left-hand side. Now on the right side, there's nothing there. There's no greeblies or anything on the right-hand side. Now, the Return of the Jedi E-11 also doesn't have T-rails, but what it does have, what looks like pieces of pipe cut in half, and there are 7 pieces of pipe cut in half that wrap around, taking up the place that the T-rails did take up. And they're each held on. Each of them has 2 flathead screws holding each one of those halves on. But anyway, thank you for following along, and I'm kind of glad that we've come to the end of the E-11. The E-11 is one of my favorite blasters. It's probably, besides Han's Hero from A New Hope, this is probably the most iconic blaster from Star Wars, is the E-11, the Stormtrooper's E-11. Join us next time when we pull out another prop, tear it down, and see what it's made of.